Take it away, Chris.
So yes, before Kaitlin gets started talking about the feasibility of iron fertilization, I'm going to give you some background. The first two things I'm going to talk about are macronutrients and micronutrients, which are pretty self-explanatory. Macronutrients are substances that are required in relatively large amounts by living organisms. Some examples are phosphorus, nitrogen, carbon, etc. Micronutrients are nutrients needed in very small amounts by living organisms. Examples are trace metals such as iron, cobalt, chromium, etc. The biological soft tissue pump is an important concept in this paper. It basically describes the vertical transport of organic carbon or biomass. In most of the ocean, approximately 25% of the biomass produced by phytoplankton during photosynthesis sinks out of the surface water, and this results in vertical gradients in macronutrients such as carbon. As you can see here, carbon goes into the ocean, phytoplankton takes it in during photosynthesis. Some dissolved carbon actually escapes back to the surface, while some sinks to the bottom as the phytoplankton die. HNLC areas, these cover about 25% of the surface ocean, where macronutrients remain mostly unused. They are known as high nitrate, low chlorophyll areas, and they tend to have low biomass. These areas cover large parts of the Southern Ocean, Equatorial Pacific, and part of the North Pacific. This is a map from the Earth Observatory showing the global distribution of chlorophyll concentration. As you can see, the Southern Oceans have huge spots of pretty low chlorophyll concentration compared to the Northern Oceans, which are generally higher. Ocean iron fertilization. John Martin was the man behind this idea. He proposed, I think in the 80s, that lack of micronutrients, specifically iron, might actually be what's limiting the uptake of carbon by phytoplankton in these HNLC areas. And he came up with the iron hypothesis that iron controls phytoplankton growth in these high nitrate, low chlorophyll regions. And he predicted that adding iron to the ocean would increase the carbon uptake and phytoplankton productivity, and since then, his hypothesis has actually been proven. Some notable experiments of the past. In 1993, Martin, who I was just talking about, went out in the field with some scientists and enriched a 64 square kilometer region in the Equatorial Pacific with iron, and the results showed doubling of plant biomass, threefold increase in chlorophyll, and fourfold increase in plant production. I actually found mention in several papers of a study of an experiment called FEX1, and I couldn't find the exact date or location, but I found myself wondering if FEX1 might be this first study by Martin.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
But when it happened, they didn't know they were going to do it again.
Yeah.
So it's after it happened, they called it Iron X1.
That's kind of what I figured.
Right.
But then in 1995, FEX2, another in situ fertilization experiment also carried out in the Equatorial Pacific, displayed similar results as iron increased, plant biomass also increased. 1999, Soiree Southern Ocean Iron Enrichment Experiment, 2000, Eisen-X Iron Experiment. These all showed relatively similar results. 2002, the study that's talked about in this paper, Southern Ocean Iron Experiment, which I will talk about more. So the Southern Ocean is the largest high nitrate, low chlorophyll region in the world. So this is why they chose to do this massive iron experiment here. They chose two sites, and they used thorium-234 as a tracer for sinking particles. And the results were the same as previous experiments, that the addition of iron resulted in enhanced growth of phytoplankton, as well as a decrease in dissolved organic carbon and nutrients in the surface waters. And this is just a figure showing where they cruise in the Southern Ocean, and showing the chlorophyll content. And that is all.
Thank you.
Is that it?
Kaitlin Jackson's going to talk to us about the paper.
Alright guys, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this feasibility of ocean fertilization and the impact on future atmospheric CO2 levels. I know there's a lot of math, bear with me, I'm going to do my best to explain it to you guys, but first of all I want to give you just a brief overview. So we're going to talk a little bit about the iron fertilization that Chris just mentioned, objectives of this study. We're going to talk about feasibility, the carbon cycle modeling that they did in this paper, and results, and then have like our discussion time. So first of all, I just want to use this picture to talk about how they would go about doing iron fertilization. So the iron would come off the ships just like this, and like Chris was saying, the phytoplankton would grow due to that and capture more CO2. So like this picture says, the fantasy is that the populations would carry most of that carbon down into this low, cool, deep layer where it would be sequestered for however long a time. They hope that it would be longer than 100 years, but there's also the fear that doing this experiment could damage food chain issues, but could also have CO2 that resurfaces in the future. So they kind of wanted to see how feasible it would be to actually carry out a large-scale experiment like this. So like I said, the purpose was just to use the data from SOFEX and assess the feasibility of sequestering that carbon dioxide. And they also wanted to use it to predict the future patterns, and we'll talk about that. That was in figure 3. So this is just that chart, the table 1. It was kind of confusing in the paper, so I wanted to break it up for you and show you a little bit about what these mean. So I'm going to define these for you. FOC is just that it's the required iron load or the desired carbon export, which is measured in billions of tons of carbon. So this is referred to a lot. They set the values as 1, 5, and 10 billion tons of carbon for each assessment that they do in the future. We'll talk about that. And then another big part of this was the RC to FE ratio right here. So this is just the ratio of the carbon exported and the iron added at each particular site. These two that say base are actually base values from the SOFEX experiment, and they use that in most of their models. But that's why the ratio is important. The next thing that's important is the F of A, which is just the carbon export per unit area. So they take a look at the total right here, AH, which is the high nitrate. This should be LC, low chlorophyll area, and then they break it up into smaller chunks, and that's what the F of A stands for. And then the next thing is the number of ships, N of S, and that varies. We'll talk about that. That's the figure 1 that they try to show you how many ships would be needed to carry out the experiment. And then ship capacity, T of S, is just to show the cargo space at each ship, so it just differs. So taking these 3 main equations that they had in the paper, I just wanted to break it down for you guys. So this, like I said, just represents the total number of ships. They use the required iron load, and then they use that ratio for the time, for the area that they have, and then capacity of the ship. And if you're wondering what this 56 out of 52 meant, it's just the molecular weight of iron by itself, and then divided by the molecular weight of iron sulfate. So it's a lot of math that I understand, but I don't like to do. I'm sure you guys feel the same way. This is just breaking down the fertilization frequency, and here A of C is the area to be fertilized versus A of H, which is that total HNLC area. And then they use this equation to further go into this, which is just the total carbon export per that small area, and then divided that by the total HNLC area. So it's kind of complicated, but this figure 1 shows the desired export at 1 billion tons of carbon, 5 billion tons of carbon, 10 billion tons of carbon. And this is just trying to prove how many ships would actually be needed to carry that amount of iron out into the sea at these desired locations. So all that you're trying to get from figure 1 is that there's 200 ships associated with 1 billion tons of carbon, 1,000 with 5 billion tons, and 2,000 with 10 billion tons of carbon. Moving on. This figure looks at fertilization frequency of that total HNLC area. So what this means is, obviously these lines are those 1, 5, 10 that we just talked about in the previous figure. And these are represented on a log scale for both fertilization frequency and the carbon export per area. So breaking this down, they've circled these three in the figure. I just wanted to point out what they mean. So this SOFEX is that base number that we had from table 1, which shows you that at the 1 billion tons, if you want to have 1 billion tons of carbon exported, you're going to have to fertilize that area 15 times per year. And I don't know if you guys caught in the figure, they explained that fertilizing 15 times per year is the equivalent of fertilizing the entire surface of the earth twice in a year. So it's pretty much impossible to do this. And if you want to get all the way up to 10 billion tons, it's going to be 154 times. Completely unfeasible to do. Talking a little bit about what they did with the modeling. So they used 3 different models, the 7-box, the ADM, and the GMC. So the 7-box is just a model that they use that has large high latitude sensitivity. And then the ADM was the advection diffusion model. So I'm sure you guys remember a little bit about that. The advection is the transfer just by flow. So what Chris was talking about in the biological pump with the particles flowing, that's where that comes into play. And then diffusion is just the spreading and dispersal of that. And then the GMC was a general circulation model that they used from the parallel ocean program model. So again, it's just like models building on models. It's kind of confusing. But what we can see from this is that in scenario 1, which is all the solid lines, for each model, there's a general trend that's about the same. The blue and the green and the red are all in the same general trend with no fertilization. So that's just if we let things go as a usual rate, business as usual, how they call it. And then scenario 2 is using high latitude nutrient depletion by 50%. So this is kind of confusing, but basically with scenario 2, the fertilization shows a reduction in the atmospheric CO2, which is the dashed line right here. And it also shows for each case an increase in oceanic uptake. So this is just proving that it works and what they're trying to do. Scenario 3 was when they increased by 1 billion tons of carbon. And I thought this was kind of strange that in scenario 3, for each case except for GMC, they didn't model scenario 3 with GMC because there was a slight difference with scenario 2, so they didn't see the need to do that. But for these two, for the box model and the ADM, scenario 3 is actually lower than scenario 2, so we'll kind of get into that with discussion. So major results that they found from this was just that sequestration is less than 10 to 25% of export, so you're really, it's basically saying for each billion ton of carbon that you put in, you're only going to sequester 0.1 to 0.25 billion tons. It's not a really good yield, and they do say that it is possible to get the ships with enough iron out into the water, but it's just not feasible for them to be able to cover the entire area to make this a good experiment or a good solution to global warming. So, and a little bit of what Chris was saying, the fertilized areas would become macronutrient depleted, and that's really an issue. And just in conclusion, it would just not a feasible strategy for the long term. So that's all we got.
Thank you.
Sorry, why is it getting dark out already? Yeah, the sunset, I don't like it.
Yeah, that's it.
Hey, man.
So why do we do? Yeah, so you can